Draw a line down the middle of the United States. Oklahoma sits right on top of it. On one side of this state line, cypress swamps thick with humidity and standing black water. On the other side, bone-dry salt flats and rolling sand dunes with mountains rising in between that could pass for the Rockies. Oklahoma sits almost exactly where the humid eastern half of America ends and the dry western half begins, the boundary climate scientists still use to split the wet forests from the dry plains. The swamps, the dunes, and the ancient mountains here all trace back to that one seam running underneath the state. This is the story of the one state built directly on top of the fault line between two different Americas, and how that seam explains almost everything strange about it. Look at almost any map that splits the United States into wet and dry, and the line lands close to the same place every time. Roughly the 98th to 100th meridian, the old boundary 19th century settlers used to describe where farming without irrigation stopped making sense. East of it, enough rain falls most years to grow corn or cotton without help from anyone. West of it, the rain drops off fast enough that unaided farmland gives way to open range, and eventually to true desert. Drive across it on a straight highway and you can watch the change happen, mile after mile, with no road sign anywhere to mark it. The ground itself doesn't change at that line. Rainfall does, and rainfall changes everything that grows on top of it. Surveyors noticed the line first, watching wagon trains cross from wooded river bottoms into treeless grassland in the space of a single day's ride. Climate scientists confirmed it a century later, with rain gauges instead of gut feeling. Agricultural agencies still use almost the same boundary today to decide which crops will survive on a given plot of land without a single drop of irrigation, more than 150 years after settlers first drew it by eye. Most states sit cleanly on one side of that line or the other and never have to think about the other half. Texas leans hard west, all cattle country, mesquite, and caliche soil baking under triple-digit summer heat. Missouri leans hard east, all hardwood forest, humidity, and rivers that never fully dry up. Oklahoma sits in a much smaller group. It straddles the seam directly, with real, drivable examples of both worlds inside its own borders, sometimes less than a day's drive apart on a single tank of gas. Cross either Texas or Missouri, and the change in vegetation alone tells you which side of the seam you are standing on. Two different climate zones occupy this one state line. They meet exactly where the map says they're supposed to meet, and Oklahoma isn't collecting a handful of odd exceptions scattered around its edges to do it. Nowhere else in the country can you stand at the edge of both in a single afternoon. Most of what follows traces back to that one fact. Start on the wet side in the far southeastern corner of the state, where the Ouachita Mountains rise straight out of the pine forest. These mountains are old, and their location here is no coincidence. They are folded, wrinkled ridges, built by the same continental collision that raised the Appalachians, back when this entire stretch of the future United States was still locked to Africa and South America inside one ancient landmass. When that landmass split apart over tens of millions of years, the mountain chain running through the seam was torn cleanly in two. One half became the Appalachians, stretching from Georgia to Maine. The other half stayed behind in what would eventually become southeastern Oklahoma. Its rock folded into a ridge and valley pattern you would recognize instantly in West Virginia or Western Virginia. The peaks here run over 2,000 feet in places, a real mountain range by any standard, not a line of hills. Drive the Talamina Scenic Byway along their spine in October, and the hillsides turn a red, orange, and gold you would expect from the Blue Ridge Parkway, not the Great Plains most people picture when they hear the word Oklahoma. 22 overlooks line the 70-mile route, and at the right elevation, on the right cold morning, fog pools in the valleys below, much the way it does across the Appalachian Range. The Ouachitas were separated from hundreds of millions of years earlier. The air itself feels thick and green up there, nothing like the wheat country 2 hours to the west. Locals treat the drive as their own fall foliage tradition, the kind more associated with New England than the southern plains. Beneath those wooded hills sits Little Dixie, southeastern Oklahoma's own pocket of cypress swamp, water tupelo, and still black water thick enough to reflect the trees standing in it. It is the western edge of the humid biome that stretches unbroken all the way to the Gulf Coast, and the swamp itself covers tens of thousands of acres across several counties. More wetland than most people would ever guess sits inside Oklahoma. Alligators live in these swamps in Oklahoma, the state most Americans picture as flat wheat fields and tornado footage. That's not a typo. It's the eastern half of the seam behaving the way the eastern half of the country behaves everywhere else it exists. Mountains, cypress swamps, and reptiles fully included. Two state wildlife refuges sit inside these eastern hills, protecting hardwood bottomland and standing swamp you would expect much closer to Louisiana. Black bears wander through it, and migratory songbirds nest here every spring. This corner of the state simply isn't the Great Plains. It's the humid East, continuing on well past the point where most people assume Oklahoma has already turned dry. Now flip to the other half of the state, and the picture changes fast. In the far northwest corner, in a strip of land barely wider than a two-lane highway, sits Black Mesa, Oklahoma's highest point, capped by hard black rock. That rock is basalt, an ancient lava flow that did not erupt anywhere close to Oklahoma. It traveled in from elsewhere, hardening on top of a plateau that physically reaches into the state from a volcanic field sitting in what is now New Mexico and Colorado, 100 miles or more from where it currently rests. The Rocky Mountain foothills genuinely extend into Oklahoma's own panhandle, not just resembling it from a distance. This is New Mexico backcountry, sitting inside Oklahoma's western border, capped in rock that cooled somewhere else entirely, on ground that still carries fossilized footprints from long before either border existed. Few visitors expect imported lava rock sitting on this state's own highest point. Oklahoma has already upset two assumptions in the first few minutes, and there's plenty more of that ahead if you subscribe and stay for the rest. Black Mesa isn't the only spot in this corner of the state holding an old story. Petrified logs and fossilized footprints, pressed into stone long before there was a panhandle to walk across, still turn up in the same badlands as the imported lava rock, showing that this ground has been changing shape for far longer than any state line has existed. Stand on that mesa top and you are looking at three entirely different geologic stories stacked on top of one another, none of which had any reason to end up in the same square mile of the country. West of the mountains, the dry side keeps getting drier. In the northwest, the Great Salt Plains sit on the crust of an ancient inland sea that finally dried up roughly 70 million years ago, leaving behind a layer of salt thick enough that modern crews still pump groundwater across shallow evaporation pools to harvest it commercially today, much the way people have worked this ground for centuries. Underneath that salt crust, in mineral conditions found in only a small handful of places on the entire planet, the ground grows hourglass-shaped selenite crystals, and the public is allowed to walk in and dig for them by hand. No permit required, no fee at the gate, just a shovel, some water, and a willingness to get properly filthy for an afternoon. Digging season runs only a few months a year, timed around when the ground is wet enough to work but dry enough to walk on. Families drive in from well outside the state just for that window, buckets and shovels in the trunk, and leave with crystals they dug out themselves. A short drive from the Salt Plains, the Blaine Escarpment, known to almost everyone locally as the Glass Mountains, is capped in that same gypsum and selenite, deposited when a shallow Permian Sea covered this stretch of the continent hundreds of millions of years ago, then left high and dry as the softer rock around it slowly eroded away over an enormous stretch of time. Tucked into that red dirt Badlands country is Alabaster Caverns, one of the largest gypsum caves open to the public anywhere in the country, its walls carved smooth by water that has been dissolving soft rock underground for longer than the mountains standing above it have existed in their current shape. Guided tours run year-round, and the cave stays close to one cool temperature no matter what the surface is doing outside. Further south, along the banks of the Cimarron River, prevailing wind has spent centuries stripping sand loose from the riverbanks and piling it into rolling dunes at what is now Little Sahara, roughly 1,600 acres of genuine shifting wind-sculpted sand sitting in the middle of the southern plains. Not the Sahara it is named for, but close enough in miniature to earn the comparison. Stand at the top of one of those dunes in the evening, with the sand throwing long shadows and not a tree in sight, and nothing in view suggests you are still hundreds of miles from any true desert. Once you're standing among the dunes, the tree line disappears in every direction, and the wind keeps reshaping the same slopes long after any footprints in the sand are gone. Salt flats and gypsum badlands are two of the driest signatures in North America. Add true sand dunes to the same short list, and all of it sits inside a single state most Americans still picture as nothing but flat, featureless farmland stretching to the horizon. Every one of them sits west of the seam, exactly where the dry half of the country is supposed to put them. The Ouachita Mountains and the Little Dixie swamps sit on the humid side of the seam because that is simply what the humid side of America looks like. Everywhere else it exists too. Black Mesa's borrowed lava rock and the Great Salt Plains sit on the dry side for the same reason. That is what the dry side looks like. Everywhere else it exists as well. These aren't misplaced landscapes scattered randomly around Oklahoma's borders. Oklahoma sits directly on top of the one line in the entire country where both halves show up inside one state, under one flag, sometimes within sight of one another on a clear day from the right hilltop. Even the wildlife here follows the pattern. American eels, born far out in the Atlantic's own Sargasso Sea and spending their entire adult lives swimming against the current, have been documented pushing their way up connected river systems into landlocked Oklahoma waterways, a species built for the open ocean, completing its entire life cycle 500 miles from the nearest coastline, because the water here eventually connects back to the seam. No other Great Plains state has anything living in its rivers with that kind of history. Biologists still aren't entirely sure how they navigate that far inland, and fishermen along these rivers occasionally pull one up without realizing how far it has traveled to get there. Place names on this seam are easy to get wrong. Ouachita is pronounced Wash-I-Ta, and Cimarron is Cimarron, both regularly butchered by outsiders reading a map cold. Eufaula comes out Eufaula. Even Boise City, the panhandle town, throws people off. Locals call it Boise City, not Boise, the way anyone would say Idaho's capital out loud. Locals notice immediately when an outsider gets these wrong, and it tends to color how much they trust anything else being said about their own state. The seam shaped more than the rock underneath everyone's feet. The Oklahoma Panhandle spent more than 3 full decades in the mid to late 1800s as an unclaimed strip of federal land, with no state government and no law enforcement willing to ride out that far to enforce anything. For most of that stretch, the nearest working courthouse was a multi-day ride in any direction. Locals still call it no man's land today, a genuine gap in the country's own map that sat legally unclaimed for an entire generation while every acre of land around it got sorted neatly into states and counties. It was a legal gap surrounded on every side by land that did belong to someone, and for a while it drew exactly the kind of people who wanted distance from any courthouse at all. Modern Oklahomans describe their own state in almost the same terms as the underlying geology, usually without anyone ever prompting them to. Ask someone from Tulsa or Oklahoma City where the real cultural line inside their own state actually sits, and plenty of them will point straight to Interstate 35, the same rough seam running through their own backyard that runs through the entire country from Texas to Minnesota. East of that line, the air stays humid and green. West of it, things dry out fast under a much bigger sky. They were describing this seam decades before anyone bothered putting a scientific name on it. Drive that interstate today, and the shift in architecture, in vegetation, even in radio stations, tracks the old climate line almost exactly, right down to which side of the highway gets a lawn and which side gets gravel. Nobody taught them the pattern directly. Growing up on one side of a state that visibly changes character somewhere around the middle does that on its own, generation after generation, long before a satellite ever confirmed exactly where the line runs. Those wet, unfamiliar Ouachita Hills carry one more piece of local color. They're one of the most consistently active Bigfoot sighting regions in the entire country, a genuine, deeply held piece of local folklore that people here will argue about at length over a beer without a hint of irony. The fog that pools in these valleys every cold morning helps explain why. Dense, wet, unfamiliar forest is exactly the kind of place folklore like this tends to take root. Similar stories show up in other dense, humid forests around the country, but rarely this far west, which is itself a small piece of evidence for how far the wet side of the seam actually reaches. Believer or skeptic, we want to know, which side of Oklahoma would you bet on for a Bigfoot sighting? The swamp or the dunes? Tell us in the comments below. Seen as a whole, Oklahoma reads less like a state with a handful of strange detours and more like a cross-section of the entire country. Most other states pick a side of this seam and stay there. Georgia stays humid border to border. Nevada never stops being dry. Oklahoma sits on the fault line itself, the exact place where the wet half of America and the dry half of America meet. That kind of split is rare enough to notice once you know to look for it, and once you've seen it in Oklahoma, it's hard to look at the rest of the map the same way. The cypress swamps, the salt flats, and the sand dunes didn't arrive here by accident. Both sides sit where the climate line puts them, on opposite ends of one seam that most Americans have driven across their entire lives without ever noticing it runs directly through the middle of their own country. Every mountain range, every dune field, every swamp covered here sits where the climate line predicts it should. Most people only ever see one half of that seam, because most people only ever visit one half of the country. Oklahoma is the rare place that hands you both halves in a single trip, close enough together that you could see the swamp in the morning and stand on the dunes by supper. If this is the kind of thing that changes how you look at a map you thought you already knew by heart, share this with the one person you know who still insists Oklahoma is just flyover country between two coasts. Oklahoma isn't an exception on the American map. It's the one place on that map where you can stand with one foot in each half of the country at the same time and feel the difference under both boots. So which side surprised you more, the swamp side or the dune side? Drop your answer in the comments below, and if one state can hold two Americas at once, other borders on the map probably carry a similar story of their own. This state carries one full seam's worth of that story. There are 49 more, and every one of them sits on a fault line of its own, ready for someone to actually go looking. It's one of the more overlooked corners of the map. Subscribe if you want to be there for the next one.